Well, on behalf of the Friends of the Scranton Public Library Poetry Series, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's reading, which is sponsored by the Friends of the Library with assistance from the Pennsylvania Council on the Arts and the Lackawanna County Arts to the People program. And before my introduction, I would just like to make a couple of announcements of other poetry events upcoming. At the University of Scranton, the University Reading Series is going to present Kathy Mangan, author of Above the Tree Line, Thursday, May 2nd, 8 p.m. in the Studio Theater in the McDade Center. And this Friday evening at 7 o'clock at the University Bookstore, an environmental poetry reading sponsored by Mulberry Poets and Writers Association. Well, I'm very pleased to have Henry Taylor with us tonight. He's come here from the Washington, D.C. area. He has been on the faculty teaching English literature at American University for many years. He has been the co-director of the creative writing program there. He's published a lot of stuff besides his poetry, essays, reviews, textbooks. Among his books of poetry are The Horse Show at Midnight, An Afternoon of Pocket Billiards, The Flying Change, and those three books, two of them actually collected together, reprinted, will be on sale after the reading. And The Flying Change is the book that he was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for in 1986. There's great variety in his poetry. I first knew of him as a writer of very witty and entertaining parodies of contemporary American poets back in the 1960s. But he writes many types of poetry. He can tell a story. He can write meditative poems. He can be light, he can be serious, he can be both at the same time, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing him this evening. So please welcome Henry Taylor.
Thank you for coming in this wonderful weather you got here. It'll be gone by the time we're through. There'll be some other weather. How would it be if you got up someday and there wasn't any? I'm going to start. I wish I had a train poem. I noticed on the way up here that I'm not far from Stroudsburg, about which I know virtually nothing at all. But you'll understand why East Stroudsburg State, as it was once called, came in handy. This poem is the title poem of my next collection, which will be out theoretically by the end of this year. With LSU Press, when they say fall, they sometimes mean January. But anyway, the title of the book is Understanding Fiction. It does have a subtitle, Poems 1986 to 1996, and I'll probably have a lot of trouble about that. There'll probably be a lot of miscatalogued copies of this book. But anyway, here's the title poem, Understanding Fiction. What brings it to mind this time? The decal from East Stroudsburg State and the window ahead of me as traffic winds to the airport? Maybe we pass the Stroudwater Landing apartments. Whatever it is, you who are with me get to hear it all over again. How once, just out of college, or maybe a year or two later, into the first teaching job, some circumstance found me in the home of an old friend, one of the mentors to whom I owe what I am, on one of those days when the airwaves are filled with football. We remember it now as 4 games, and swear to each other and to others that this is what happened. In the second game, as men unpiled from a crowded scramble, a calm voice remarked that Mike Stroud had been in on the tackle. And we told ourselves that we had heard the same thing in the first game. Odd. So we listened, or claimed to be listening, and drank, and took what we were pleased to call notice. Never an isolating or identifying shot. Just these brief observations of crowds. Mike Stroud was in all 4 games. An astonishing trick, a terrific story, some plot of the color commentators, a tribute to a friend with a birthday, or maybe just a joke on the world. I tell it at least 4 times a year, and each time it is longer ago. Mike Stroud, if he ever played football, does not do so now, but he might even have played only one game that late fall day in, 1967, let's say. We were drinking. God knows what we heard. But I tell it again and see how to help you believe it. So I make some adjustment of voice or detail, and the story strides into the future. I'm going to read a handful of poems now that mentor, whom I did not name in that poem, but I don't mind at all naming him for you. He's the poet and novelist George Garrett, who arrived at the University of Virginia at the beginning of my 3rd year there, and to put it very briefly, changed my life. One of the ways in which he did that was he was my creative writing teacher, so I went to the bookstore and bought his books and read them. I thought anybody would do that. I've learned better since. But among the poems that he published were little anecdotes, little almost jokes, really. And I thought, well, if those are poems, maybe these are too. Blackberries. On top of a ragged hill on the farm next to my father's, an old man sat on his front porch and reigned over a dominion of thistles and briars. In his meadow, never mowed, blackberries grew wild, overran the field, smothered the grass, bound the cows, and ate them alive. My sisters and I would steal under his fence, armed with pails, to pick as many berries as we could. We never got them all, hard as we tried. One afternoon, we stood in the briars reaching for berries over our heads, each one hanging before us like a bunch of grapes, when down from his porch the old man tumbled down the hill toward us, wild white hair in the wind, scattering all of his chickens as he ran. His tiny dog yapped at his heels, "Go back where you belong right now," and he waved his arms. We turned and ran for the fence, clutching the pails in our arms, scattering berries behind us. We looked back once and saw him on the hill, shaking his fist in the wind and shouting, "If you're too lazy to raise your own blackberries, by God, you shan't have mine." And then a few years later in another book, one called Writing Lesson, which I'm pretending that I need to find, and I don't really. I learned 2 things from an early writing teacher. He held a nervous filly in one hand and gestured with the other, saying, "Listen, keep one leg on one side, the other leg on the other side, and your mind in the middle." He turned and mounted. She took 2 steps, then left the ground, I thought, for good. But she came down hard, humped her back, swallowed her neck, and threw her rider as you'd throw a rock. He rose, brushed his pants and caught his breath and said, "See, that's the way to do it. When you see they're going to throw you, get off." And this next snapshot takes its title from rather pretentiously takes its title from William James, but it's not. It's a good idea to read William James, but not in order that you might understand this poem better. The poem is called Varieties of Religious Experience. And these days, given certain political phenomena and realities, I feel constrained to say at the outset that this is a true story, which I was told by my father, and that I wrote down only because I liked the sound at the end of it, of the slightly profane oxymoron in it. An oxymoron, everybody these days knows what an oxymoron is. It got to be a kind of buzzword, I think, but you know, it's a phrase that contradicts itself immediately, like ornamental cabbage. Adult male. Varieties of religious experience. This old day worker cleaning up the grounds of an abandoned church, getting ready to paint and put in glass, said somebody from away from here had bought it and was going to start using it again. Well, it had been a Methodist church. Were these Methodists? He believed it wasn't anybody like that. No, sir, he said. It is some of these holy sanctified goddamn people. We're pretty close now, I guess, well, closer than when I'm at home in Virginia, anyway, to the birthplace of the great modernist poet Wallace Stevens. And I will risk insulting you by reminding you that Wallace Stevens was not only a great poet who lived from, I don't know exactly when he was born, 1879 maybe, something like that. 1870s, died in 1955, spent most of his life not only writing great poems, but being a gradually ascending member of Hartford Insurance Company. He was a vice president of the Hartford Insurance Company for a very long time. And I suppose at that time may have been America's richest poet, I don't know. As well as one of the largest and palest, and there are a lot of other things about him. But a wonderful, I mean, if you haven't spent a little time with the idea of Order at Key West, someday you should do that. It's an amazing poem. Within a stone's throw of greatness. Among the guests I talked to once at a wedding in the late 60s, back when the principals at such affairs were my own friends, not my children's, there was the father of the groom, and turned out to be a vice president with the Hartford Insurance Company. It had been almost 13 years since the death of Wallace Stevens, but I put the question anyway. Yeah, I knew Wally. I even know why you're asking. I'm aware that he wrote poetry. I never read any of it, but I'll tell you this, he was a hell of an underwriter. A lot of my poems arise from my having grown up in the country out about 50 miles west of Washington, and I still live there, strangely enough. It's almost un-American, I think, to have to get your mail at the same post office you got it at when you were in high school, but there it is. I do that. And I'm going to read a poem called Harvest about a period of time when I was going back to that countryside as a visitor. I taught at the University of Utah for a while, back in the late 60s and early 70s. And so when I went home, it was for visits in the summertime. Harvest. Every year in late July, I come back to where I was raised, to mosey and browse through old farm buildings, over fields that seem never to change, rummaging through a life I can no longer lead and still cannot leave behind, looking for relics which might spring back to that life at my touch. Today, among thistles and ragweed, I stumble on a discarded combine, the old kind we pulled with a tractor to cut and thresh barley and wheat. Now it lies listing into the side of this hill like a stone or an uprooted stump, harboring snakes and wasps, rusting slowly down into the briars. Still, I climb to the seat, wondering if it will still hold me, fumbling for pedals and levers I used to know by heart. Above my head, the grain pipe forks down to the bag clamps, and a wad of tie strings, gone weedy and rotten, still hangs by my right hand. As I touch these things, this machine I once knew by many unprintable names moves out through barley in late July, and the stalks fall to the knife as the paddle reel sweeps them in. On wide canvas belts, cut grain rides into the dark insides of the combine where frantic shakers and screens break the grain loose from the stalks and the chaff. Almost invisible, small spines from the grain heads pour out through holes in the metal, billowing into a cloud that moves with us over the hills, engulfing me, the machine, the tractor and driver, as we work in a spiral to the center of the field, rolling back through the years in a dust cloud. The spines stick to my skin, work into my pores, my bloodstream, and finally blaze into my head like a miniature cactus of hatred for all grain, for flour and cereal and bread, for mildewed surplus swelling in Midwestern silos. Never again, I thought once as I rode out the cloud until sundown, never again. I climb down and walk out through the thistles, still breathing 15-year-old barley. The years in the cloud drift back to me. Metal rusts into the hill. Barley dust pricks at my brain, and I am home. And now I'll read one called Breakings, about which I used to have a whole bunch of spontaneous remarks, as we call them in the trade, explaining what a combine is. Now you know. I will say that there's a real failure of nerve at the end of this poem, which I'm attempting gradually to correct. I refer in the poem to a lunge line, which is spelled L-O-N-G-E. And equestrian purists will know what I'm talking about, but there aren't that many of those. It's a line that you fasten to a horse's head and you hold the other end of it and you work the horse around you in a circle, teaching it voice commands and balance and transitions from one gait to another and so on. Lunge line. All of my editors have said, you know, everybody's going to think it's a typo. So I've left it long line in print, but I'm going to read it as lunge line. Breakings. Long before I first left home, my father tried to teach me horses, land, and sky, to show me how his kind of work was done. I studied how to be my father's son, but all I learned was, when the wicked die, they ride combines through barley forever. Every summer I hated my father as I drove hot horses through dusty grass, and so I broke with him and left the farm for other work, where unfamiliar weather broke on my head, an unexpected storm, and things I had not studied came to pass. So nothing changes, nothing stays the same, and I have returned from a broken home alone to ask for a job breaking horses. I watch a colt on a lunge line making tracks in dust, and think of the kinds of breakings there are, and the kinds of restraining forces. I'm going to read a real horror story now, but it's short. It's called Barbed Wire. One summer afternoon, when nothing much was happening, they were standing around a tractor beside the barn while a horse in the field poked his head between two strands of the barbed wire fence to get at the grass along the lane. When it happened, something they passed around the wood stove late at night for years but never could explain. Someone may have dropped a wrench into the toolbox or made a sudden move or merely thought what might happen if the horse got scared. And then he did get scared, jumped sideways and ran down the fence line, leaving chunks of his throat, skin, and hair on every barb for 10 feet before he pulled free and ran a short way into the field, stopped and planted his hoofs wide apart like a sawhorse, hung his head down as if to watch his blood running out, almost as if he were about to speak to them who almost thought he could regret that he no longer had the strength to stand, then shuddered to his knees, fell on his side, and gave up breathing while the dripping wire hummed like a bowstring in the splintered air. This poem mentions a machine called a bush hog. Bush hog is one of those words like Kleenex or Frigidaire. It's a brand name, actually. It's become a generic term in the minds of most people, with the exception of the stockholders and directors of the Woods Manufacturing Company who make bush hogs. And they would rather you call them something else, but I haven't been able to find out what. They're big rotary mowers that you hitch to a tractor. If you haven't seen them in fields, you've seen them in median strips. I think that's all you need. Landscape with tractor. How would it be if you took yourself off to a house set well back from a dirt road with, say, 3 acres of grass bounded by road, driveway, and vegetable garden? Spring and summer you would mow the field not down to lawn, but with a bush hog, every 6 weeks or so, just often enough to give grass a chance and keep weeds down. And one day, call it August, hot, a storm recently passed, things green and growing a bit, and you're mowing with half your mind on something you'd rather be doing, or did once. 3 rounds, and then on the straight alongside the road, maybe 3 swaths in from where you are now, you glimpse it. People will toss all kinds of crap from their cars. Clothing store dummy, for God's sake. Another 2 rounds and you'll have to stop, contend with it, at least pull it off to one side. You keep going. 2 rounds more, then down off the tractor, and Christ, not a dummy, a corpse. The field tilts, whirls, then steadies as you run. Telephone, sirens. 2 local doctors use pitchforks to turn the body, some 4 days dead and ripening, and the cause of death no mystery. 2 bullet holes in the breast of a well-dressed black woman in perhaps her mid-30s. They wrap her, take her away. You take the rest of the day off. Next day you go back to the field, having to mow over the damp dent in the tall grass where bluebottle flies are still swirling. But the bush hog disperses them and all traces. Weeks pass. You hear at the post office that no one comes forward to say who she was. Brought out from the city, they guess, and dumped like a bag of beer cans. She was someone, and now is no one, buried or burned or dissected, but gone. And I ask you again, how would it be to go on with your life, putting gas on the tractor, keeping down thistles, and seeing, each time you pass that spot, the form in the grass, the bright yellow skirt, black shoes, the thing not quite like a face whose gaze blasted past you at nothing when the doctors heaved her over, to wonder from now on what dope deal, betrayal, or innocent refusal brought her here, and to know she will stay in that field till you die. Well, maybe I'll read a handful of poems that touch down along and I don't like to stress the autobiographical element too much in poems. I think it gives the idea that that some way or another the poet thinks his life is different from other people's in some fundamental way, and I don't believe that. But I do occasionally write about what has happened to me. And so I'm going to read a few poems. One of them I've already read, Breakings, which refer to the somewhat curious fact, I guess, that at a very young age I fell in love with a woman and married her, and we couldn't hold it together because we didn't understand in those days that, we had the idea it was supposed to be easy. To stay together if you really loved each other, nothing to it, right? So we couldn't do it, and we split up and lost touch with each other completely for about 27 years, during which time we each got married again, had some kids. And last year, after considerable study and meditation, came to the conclusion that we had given the divorce as good a try as we had any business giving it, and that it had not succeeded. So we've been married for 30 years off and on. And this is another poem about the same time as Breakings, called Among the Departures from This House. In Coke bottles waiting to be returned, under the faded couch, beside the bed, in empty cups which perch about the room, dust settles, gathers, breeds, and comes alive. It grows like snow. Nothing improves before the slow and tactless onslaught of my hands, until, as I lie sifting towards sleep, the little balls of dust unite, fall in, move out like lemmings, marching against the wind. Sort of wish fulfillment fantasy of a young slob. This is a poem that, for a long time, until I really understood something more about my life, I thought this was about a moment that comes to all of us if we live long enough. I see a number of people here to whom it probably has not come yet, at least I hope not. But it will, and if you are fortunate enough to live long enough, and you can survive it. It's sobering, but it's that moment when you realize with a kind of piercing clarity that had previously been denied to you, that out of all those things you were going to get around to someday, a certain number of them are just not going to be got around to. Okay, well, then let's see what does get gotten around to. That's what I thought it was about for a long time. But it's about something else too. It's called The Muse Once More. I take the air, the sun, my ease, letting things go for a while as the dog blunders from my feet to the curb and back. The words in the book I am holding recede, waver into illegibility. The air trembles with jet planes, birds invade. It is one of those days when nothing at all can go wrong. Across the way, I see my neighbor lurching onto his lawn with some machine. A rug shampooer? No. He straps a box to his side, fastens earphones to his head, and walks his lawn, sweeping before him the sensitive disc of a metal detector. What in God's name is he looking for? It is 10:30. He ought to be at work, but neither am I, so I do not hail him. Back and forth he trudges over the spongy grass, swinging the handle, his head cocked for a signal whose meaning I cannot guess. A lost earring, perhaps, or the tap to the water meter. No relics lie in this developed earth. The sun moves higher overhead. He sweats, walks on, and in my own head I begin to carry that heavy intentness, waiting for the whine that will let me know I have struck what? The cars pass on their various errands, snapping the asphalt bubbles, and I doze here, dreaming that something lies under a suburban lawn, waiting to change my life, to draw me away from what I chose too long ago, to forsake it now, on some journey out of legend, to smuggle across the world's best guarded borders this token, whatever it is, that says, I have risked my life for this moment. Do not forget me. Whatever this makes me, accept it. By this let me be known. And my neighbor walks on, hunting the emblem that will tell him who he is now or might once have become. I will not wait to watch him find it. Let it be the lost treasure that turns his head on the pillow as he drifts, as I do, toward sleep, out of the life he has chosen. And in a much shorter version of a similar feeling, I guess, although this one may be about something a little closer to maybe pathological depression. It's called Not Working, and I take it that it means both not doing any work and out of order. Whatever he was doing, he looks up and stares past whatever there is, a lamp, a window, trees, the shingled garden shed, as if he were about to think of something that might have happened to him once and now refuses to occur to him again. He stares then, doing absolutely nothing for minutes, hours, or a whole afternoon, as the lamp burns and sunlight on the shed brightens and fades. The trees put out their leaves and let them fall, and seasons wear away the days when what he wanted had a name. This is called Underpass. Refers to a specific, it's a railroad bridge actually that goes across a street in the town where the University of Virginia is, Charlottesville. Right near the hospital, there's a place where the railroad bridge is so close to the street, there's it's a dangerous clearance sign. I forget what it is, but it may be under 13 feet. It's changed over the years. Underpass. We were walking at dusk through the neighborhood where we had fallen in love. Just past the theater, under the railroad bridge, we paused to watch a camper-topped pickup negotiate the dangerous clearance there. A passenger, a woman of maybe 20, in close-fitting jeans and the long hair of those days, danced down from the running board into the street and stood where she could watch the critical, diminishing space. She waved the driver on, and as the cab drew abreast of where we were, we saw another young woman crouched over the wheel, peering first at the underside of the bridge, then at her friend or sister, and inching slowly forward. They were young and beautiful, we thought, and so, to tell the truth, were we. This was probably 1964. We held our breath as they made it through. The passenger floated back into her seat, and the camper's taillights melted into the traffic. For all we knew, they were taking it a few blocks, but something told us they had far to go. We loaded some dreams of our own into that truck and gripped each other's arms as it pulled away. Today, using the phone to do some serious work on the miles between us, we thought of them and wondered where they had gone, with what cargo. Like us, they're pushing 50 or have passed it, and may, like us, have children on one road or another. If we could tell them anything, we would try to thank them for having carried some fragile promises of ours to a place where, as things have turned out, they could be kept. Those decades back, my love, we wished them well. And if that wish had any force at all, they came in off the road some time ago and may even be as beautiful as you. Another couple of mushy love poems here. This one is called A Grace, which I take it means both a blessing and a gracefulness. There's a reference in it to a French entree called bœuf carbonade. You may have heard Garrison Keillor refer to bœuf carbonara, the Italian, the Franco-Italian version. It means bœuf carbonade literally means charred beef. As Mark Twain said of Wagner's music, it's better than it sounds. A grace. I give thanks for the way dance takes on the familiarity of ritual. From the moment of decision reached in a mixture of eagerness and relief, you'll roast a chicken maybe, or walk us both toward bœuf carbonade. Through the several subtasks we can or cannot help each other do, and we quiet down, hearing small sounds of lettuce being torn, prunes snipped in quarters, the nearly silent bristles of the mushroom brush, and then the table set and served, the centering on a moment of hope and gratitude as once again we face each other, having done a small and daily kind of work in a large, eternal kind of joy. This is not all love poetry here. This is a series of three kind of vignettes from different parts of the same person's life. A person sort of like me, but I think of him as a kind of fictional character. I don't really remember having done anything quite like what's described in part one here, but it was 3 short parts, 9 lines each. They all have something to do with maps, cartography. A topo sheet is a kind of map that you can get from the U.S. Geological Survey, an unusually detailed map of an area. It covers 7.5, the largest scale ones cover 7.5 minutes, which is a pretty small area. The quadrangles have very local names. And your house is on them. I mean, you can look at, oh, that's my house. Yes, you can do that. Unfolded maps. 1. Upstairs at the end of a narrow room, the boy once had a bureau with a pair of shallow top drawers. He pulled one out and turned it over, and with red crayon drew on the underside a box, and from the box a dotted line along a stream, beside a tiny house with one red line of chimney smoke, toward a stubbed tree with a hole in it. There he thought to hide whatever it was. 2. Some days I travel more in time than space. These faint blue lines are paths to where I rode one summer, waiting for a horse to land beyond the third fence of an in-and-out and turn toward the water or the brush. The course was charted on a poster board beside the entrance gate. I'd studied it, but couldn't call it back for anything. Some days I rode off course, and some days on. 3. Even a topographic sheet could never capture what it is to travel from your collarbone elsewhere by way of points of interest not to be denoted on a dry table of conventions, though legend might be a title fetched just far enough from where we started to place above the story we tell now, here beside this fire, which I mark X. Okay, back to the Flying Change for a couple of, well, for the title poem for one thing. People sometimes wonder what it's about. It's not about some poor guy who has a video arcade coming back from the bank and being hit by a truck. It's an equestrian term. When a horse canters or gallops, and for most of us those are the same thing, one front foot is in front of the other like this, and the same is true of the hind legs. They're doing like this, and the horse can, this is the leading foreleg, and the horse can lead on either foreleg. He's born knowing how to do that, and he's more comfortable going around a turn with the leading foreleg on the inside of the curve. They're just better balanced that way. So you'll see even just, a few days old foals, when they begin to gambol around in a field, you see them make this change of lead just whenever they go around a turn. It's a little trickier getting them to do it when you want them to do it when you're riding them. That takes a while. So the first part of the poem is a prose paragraph that says some of what I've already said. And then the second part of the poem is 3 short metrical stanzas. The Flying Change. 1. The canter has 2 stride patterns, one on the right lead and one on the left, each a mirror image of the other. The leading foreleg is the last to touch the ground before the moment of suspension in the air. On cantered curves, the horse tends to lead with the inside leg. Turning at liberty, he can change leads without effort during the moment of suspension, but a rider's weight makes this more difficult. The aim of teaching a horse to move beneath you is to remind him how he moved when he was free. 2. A single leaf turns sideways in the wind in time to save a remnant of the day. I am lifted like a whip crack to the moves I studied on that barbered stretch of ground, before I schooled myself to drift away from skills I still possess but must outlive. Sometimes when I cup water in my hands and watch it slip away and disappear, I see that age will make my hands a sieve. But for a moment, the shifting world suspends its flight and leans toward the sun once more, as if to interrupt its mindless plunge through works and days that will not come again. I hold myself immobile in bright air, sustained in time, astride the flying change. Here's a poem about a kind of desire that parents have a very hard time learning to outgrow or to let go of. It takes its title from a poem by Sir Walter Raleigh. Raleigh wrote a little sonnet. I don't know why I should call it a little sonnet. They're all the same size, aren't they? Seamus Haney pointed out one time, 10 by 14. Raleigh's sonnet is often anthologized under the title Sir Walter Raleigh to his son. I don't know what he called it, maybe nothing. But the premise of his sonnet is that there are three things that grow and flourish and do just fine as long as they don't get together. And they are trees and hemp and waggish little boys. But if you put them all together in one place, you might have a hanged person, and that would be too bad. His poem ends, "Mark well, dear boy, whilst these assemble not. Green springs the tree, hemp grows, the wag is wild, but when they meet, it makes the timber rot, it frets the halter, and it chokes the child. Then bless thee, and beware, and let us pray we part not with thee at this meeting day." Pretty hard-nosed poem. Raleigh was a pretty hard-nosed guy. A really good poet for somebody who didn't think he was mostly a poet. You know, there's a lesson for all of us students of creative writing in the careers of people like Sir Walter Raleigh. Green springs the tree. My young son lurches halfway down the stair, or shrieks and totters midway through a climb from the wobbling bookcase to the rocking chair. I freeze and hold my breath. Most of the time, I am too far away to break the fall that seldom comes. Instead, I stoop and bend with him, as if threads of remote control could reel out and connect him to my hand that strains against his fall, against my leap to rescue him. My twisting body prays for skill in this, the high wire he will keep both of us on, as we rehearse the ways to braid these strands of our inheritance and teach poor body English how to dance. A couple more about in that vein, and then I think I'll be almost finished. Here's one. This one is called Popped Balloon. It took me, it's fair to say that it took me about 18 years to write this. It wasn't 18 years in which I thought of nothing else. But I got it, you know, what's described in the first part of the poem, I wrote down almost immediately, and then I said, well, yeah, that's about what happened, okay. So what? You know, what of it? What is this really about? And I didn't know, so I put it away, and every so often I would see it as I flipped past it, you know, in that folder that I get out when I want to look at half-finished poems and see which one says work on me today. And eventually I got back to this one after the main character had been kind enough to show me a few more things. For 2 days off and on, the little boy inflated a balloon and let it go, whooping as it careened with a Bronx cheer to a corner of the room where after a while he let it lie for another day or so, then found it, tried to blow it up, and stood dead still when it exploded in his face. He wept and banged his forehead with his hand while I told him how balloons get old and tired from all that getting fat and going thin. No use explaining. He wanted to have it back. There are others, I said. No, that one. More tears. At last, he huffed a desperate breath at it. The air flapped loosely through the ragged end and made a splattered moan like a ripped kazoo, a ghastly, joyful noise that set him off through the house again, amazed at what he'd found. I cheered him on. How could I keep from thinking of other things that weaken until they break and limp through the world, making their healing groans? A few more breaths, and 2 decades are gone. Now, here is this young man, becoming more himself with every blessing, every wound. Like any doting father, I have prayed, but he already bears his share of scars and finds, in answer to my selfish hopes, fresh uses for what's left of broken toys, a keener ear for the joy in crippled songs. And I think I'll end, is that about right, time-wise, you think? You don't have to answer that unless I'm in real trouble. Yeah, this is a slightly longer poem called Afternoons with a Boomerang. And it makes very indirect, oblique reference to the fact, I've mentioned this once briefly before in a slightly comical sense, but there are forms of depression that respond very poorly to cheerful advice that you ought to just pull yourself together. Richard, the person here named Richard is the younger brother of the fellow with the balloon. Afternoons with a Boomerang. An insect afternoon of annoyance, discontent, the vain wish to be far away, and I sit on the patio staring at lawn, woods, receding green patches with the impossible loveliness of vanished children's books. Yet here it is around me, consoling if not healing. I know no kinder place in which to bear involuntary gloom. Then across the patio comes a blur, red shorts, legs, arms, 3 strides to grass, and I can focus now on Richard, coming out from under the weight of his own troubles, his hand cocked, gripping a bright handmade boomerang that now he throws like a knife at a target. For 60 instantaneous feet it flies straight, then yanks left and banks upward, tilting into level flight, a spun, evanescent circle back to the house, then toward another sweep by the woods, flickering in and out of view against backgrounds of sycamore and maple, sky and grass, a flutter of silence to where he pirouettes, watching the cycle close as the end of the spiral drops within reach, and he plucks it from air. Our separate woes may not pass for more than a moment, but this is the moment. Not that he never misses. The stick will spin too hard to be caught, or a stray current of air from the woods grabs an edge, or he has to look into the sun. Sometimes the gravel driveway breaks his stride over the dampening grass. 20 minutes, half an hour, and his arm tires. Still, it always feels like forever. Infinite small variations within the aboriginal pattern. And I think that whatever their use among hunters, artists most deeply own these physical mysteries of getting a skill right, or nearly so, or rarely of getting it wrong, the shout going up at the botched release, the sharp smile of disgust as the boomerang goes off course and snags itself in a tree. Error and correction, flight and return, my son pulling hard as he can toward making a life that is his, lifting himself a little from his private griefs, and me for a while out of mine. And though the pain returns, he gives in fading light a look of birthright ease to a difficult thing. Whatever unrolls on this spiral path, lifelong though it may be, and hard, is worth no more in the end than these crystal instants of grace and light-hearted awe. Thank you.
As I said, we have some books for sale, and in a few minutes I have some refreshments, and I'm sure Mr. Taylor will be willing to sign books and speak with any of you, answer questions perhaps. Do remember about the door when you leave, and thank you very much for coming.